welcome to Scare You to Sleep. I'm your host, Shelby Novak, and I'm here to read you a bedtime story. Before we begin, just a reminder that I will be at Hellmouth Con on June 15th, so if you're going to be in attendance of this Buffy the Vampire Slayer themed convention taking place at the real high school that was the set of Sunnydale High, please find me and say hi. It's in Torrance. Tickets are still available. I'll put the link for the tickets in the show notes. Now, on to this week's story. Tonight I have for you a tale by an author who is simply known as Some Unholy Obscenity. This is Archimedes Backpack. When I think back on it, I never knew what my dad did for work when I was a kid. He was gone a lot, and it meant that I was able to play video games into the late hours, since he wouldn't come home until the sun shone its shining face to all who welcomed it. Time at my dad's house was always awkward. Mom and him had never been married, and therefore our time was split. Mom with custody and Dad with visitation. I saw him very little, made less so by whatever work he had been doing all throughout my childhood. Doesn't really matter. It feels significant because the summer I spent with him when I was 14 years old recently flooded back to me like a tidal wave. A whole era blocked out because I guess that's what trauma does. The only reason I remembered at all was a single photo. One upload from an old friend with the caption, "Good times," and 0 comments or likes. That would seem normal in most cases, but not when the account used was originally created by someone who was dead. Someone I'd entirely forgotten was dead. It wasn't long after that the account was deleted, so I'm not sure what really happened there. My best guess is a family member or close friend going through their things and stumbled upon a password and a photo folder. Still, whoever had done it sent a shockwave through me like no other, and it overall felt really disrespectful to the person's loved ones, even if they belonged to that group themselves. When I was 14 years old, I told my mom that I hated her. I didn't mean it, but we'd been fighting to such a degree that it felt like the right thing to say. Her demands for help around the house and for me to eat and dress a certain way didn't sit well in my teenaged, rebellious brain. So when the fight came to a head, I shouted it at her. I felt instant regret as I watched her eyes bubble up like a boiling kettle. Both rage and sadness vying for control of her next actions. We didn't talk that night. We didn't really talk the rest of that week, to tell you the truth. One night during the week, I overheard her on the phone with someone in what sounded like a heated disagreement. I didn't catch much of the conversation, but I could piece together what was happening. And when my dad called me within the next half hour, I knew I'd been right. They both discussed that maybe it would be good for me to stay with him for the summer. See some new things, meet some new friends, be in the city for a few months to know what it was like. I didn't hate the idea, and so I agreed. Next thing I knew, most of my stuff had been packed while I'd been at school. Looking back, I think my mom had taken time off work to do that. I really hurt her. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for that. 2 weeks came and went, and my mother drove me to meet my father in the city. I helped lug my duffel bags full of clothes and gaming gear from car to car, and said goodbye to my mom. It was the first time I'd left anywhere from her care, and we didn't hug. I remember that stinging. My dad and I had a rather quiet car ride back, I remember as well. We chatted a bit on how school was going and a couple things he had planned, but I knew he didn't have much for us to do together. We normally bonded on weekends when I'd see him regularly, and now with me there for 3 whole months, I don't think he'd been prepared for what that meant. Hell, I know I sure wasn't. But we were good about it. We were happy spending time on our own and then having a night of movies and takeout to really hang out every once in a while. It just worked for us. He worked overnight shifts, and so he was exhausted in the morning and asleep by 2 p.m. Being a teenager, I couldn't handle sitting inside all day, and luckily his apartment was not that far from a huge park, and even better, a recreation center right on the other side of it had an enormous pool in it. That's where my summer was really spent. That's where I met Chris. The first week or so was spent just wandering by myself. I'd go to the park with headphones blasting whatever new Warped Tour band I'd found on MySpace. I walked around the recreation center, but never had the courage to really go in by myself. I was in a phase of very much wanting to look cool, and so putting on swim trunks really wasn't my gambit at the time. At the end of my first week was when I met everyone. A group of kids my age I hadn't noticed before were at the playground intended for much younger kids. They were blaring some metal band out of their phones at an obnoxious volume, which was 100% my shit. I approached them and started talking out my ass about how their old stuff was better, like I had any idea what that meant. Me and one of the kids got into a faux argument about band member changes and creative direction. It was stupid. We were stupid kids. Turns out, though, that's exactly the kind of thing they all wanted to hear. There were 4 of them in total. Molly was a tall, lanky girl with huge red hair and blacked-out clothes, devil-may-care attitude, and, after future conversations happened, a real violent streak. Brandon felt like an impromptu leader of sorts, corralling the group to do things. He was a pretty boy who'd leaned somewhat emo, but in a way you could tell was for show. Keegan wore baggy-as-hell clothes, and, as far as I'm aware, the only one who actually dug the music deep down. He played guitar and could talk for hours on end about it. It was him who argued with me about the bands. And then there was Chris. It's interesting meeting the outcast in a group of outcasts. The one who feels like the true outlier from society. That was how I would describe Chris. He didn't care about his aesthetic like the rest of us did. He openly admitted that he preferred classical and jazz music, and he never really talked about himself. Everyone else was so eager to share their thoughts and opinions on just about anything, but not Chris. He would just smile and nod and seemed genuinely happy to be around friends. But he never let himself take up any space. Aside from introductions and the fact that metal wasn't his forte, it was like pulling teeth to get him to say much. One other thing he did say was that he loved water. I thought that was strange because I'd assumed he'd meant drinking water when he said it. He explained that while he does believe we should only drink water, simultaneously as I slammed down my 3rd Monster Energy of the day, what he meant was he loved being in water. He loved the shape of it and how it influenced our lives so dramatically that it was such a simple thing that dominated an entire planet. When the group would be making plans to spray paint or steal from the department store nearby, Chris would be talking to me about water and the science behind it. Specifically, he talked to me about Archimedes' principle. Even remembering it as an adult, my grasp on the concept is tenuous, but I'll do my best to explain it simply. Essentially, it is the idea that liquid creates a resistant reaction to a body entering it, and that reaction is measured by how much water of that liquid has had its space taken up by the body. He expressed that the reason he focused so intently on this law of physics was due to it feeling really relevant to himself. Chris told me he didn't want to take up space in a group because he feared he would displace those that were a part of it. I didn't know why then, but that comparison made me so sad. I know for a fact that the concept flew right over my head back then, and I just tried to tell Chris that I liked him, and that the others liked him as well. We were happy to have him around, and he was a chill guy to hang out with. He nodded simply with the half smile he always wore. He said he wanted to go swimming when he came out tomorrow, and that he wanted all of us to. I figured Brandon had made enough calls on activities and agreed with him. Told him I'd talk to everyone and see how they felt. When we were discussing this, a car came to a screeching halt on the side of the park. The driver laid on the horn so aggressively and over. Chris sighed, grabbed his backpack, and told me he had to go. He walked towards the car, not parked and definitely cutting traffic off, that was still honking its horn like the driver had died behind the wheel. I didn't hear much when he opened the rear passenger door, but I can tell you it was definitely screaming. A mountain of swears aimed for Chris as he passively shut the door. The car made an illegal U-turn and left like a bat out of hell. The group told me that day that Chris's dad would hit him pretty often. From what they understood, Chris's dad was a drunk and a drug addict. His home life, since they'd known him, was bad and worsening. His mom left when he was much younger, and it was just him and his dad living in a nearby trailer park. He was able to come out because most of the time his dad was too intoxicated to notice his disappearance. But when his dad realized that there was no dinner made or the entire trailer hadn't been cleaned, he'd come and get Chris, and it would usually be ugly. My heart broke for him, and I told the group we were going swimming tomorrow, for Chris's sake. I couldn't tell you why none of us reported his dad. I imagined to some degree that we were all too scared to get involved, and that if Chris was taken by CPS, we'd never see him again. I hate thinking about that now. I recognized far too late how different the future would have been had any of us intervened earlier. We all planned to meet at the recreation center the next day. I'd gotten everyone's phone number aside from Chris's, and we texted late into the night. We bullshitted and talked about music and sent memes before we knew they were called memes. But my mind kept drifting to the conversation Chris and I had. Archimedes' principle. I'd thought about why he learned it in the first place, as none of my 8th grade science classes had referenced it. Could have been a high school lesson, and Chris was just a super smart kid. He seemed the type. Something about it just felt strange to me. His love for water didn't feel that odd, but the specifics he spoke about were what gave me an inexplicable knot in my stomach. When the afternoon of the following day arrived, I was already waiting outside the rec center with swim trunks and some cash for entry. Keegan was the first to arrive in what looked like basketball shorts. I gave him crap about not having real swim trunks, and we joked with each other, poking fun at our outfits and talking music. 15 minutes later, Chris arrived in swim trunks with a backpack slung over one shoulder. I had to assume someone had messaged him that was in more regular contact than I was, but I stood up and greeted him a bit too eager. He smiled the shy way he did and dropped the backpack he had on the ground. When it touched the stone, my eyebrow raised. The sound wasn't that of books or food clattering roughly on the ground, but of small moving objects rolling around the inside of his pack. I asked what he had with him, and he just shrugged and said, A little experiment. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I didn't want to pry too deep into it. I'm sure he had to do whatever he could to stay sane if he was dealing with his dad every day. Molly and Brandon showed up together. Keegan whispered to me and Chris something about them hooking up, but I really didn't care at that point. I was perplexed by what it was Chris had brought with him. I think the thought nagged at me longer than I'd anticipated due to the fact that I'd never get the answer. I wasn't going to ask, and I wasn't going to look into his backpack. It just stuck in my head as a mystery to remain unsolved. Once everyone was gathered, we wasted no time in getting to the poolside. The locker rooms were musty, and me and the other guys had to not die from laughing at how many people openly took their dicks out in a place like this. We were 14. What do you expect? Everyone put their things into lockers haphazardly. Except for Chris. Chris hadn't prepared in any way once we'd gotten into the locker room. He hadn't even taken his shirt off. Again, I said nothing. I had to let the sleeping dog lie, as much as I wanted to figure it out. The pool itself was split into two areas, one that was a bit more shallow and had loose noodles and tubes flying around from the copious amount of children that permeated it. The bigger one was certainly intended to be more for doing laps, but also had a diving board and even a slide that dropped you into the deepest area. We all agreed on the deeper one. For a good while, everyone was having a great time. We all made sure to include Chris in the conversations, and I was really stoked on how inclusive everyone had been that day. While yesterday showed me a rebellious side of these newfound friends, this time they showed me that they could be caring and involved. I was glad to have met everyone, and even after 2 days, I was excited to spend more time with everyone. Eventually, it came to me and Chris, sitting in poolside chairs by ourselves. He hadn't once, for the hour and a half we'd been there, taken off his backpack. With everyone else preoccupied with various activities, and laughing at Keegan failing a dive from the diving board, I decided my curiosity couldn't be postponed any longer. I asked Chris what he had in his backpack. His smile didn't fade entirely, but certainly began diminishing. He looked at his feet for a long time before he told me that he'd put rocks in it. I was puzzled, and followed up by asking, what for? Chris said it was to test buoyancy. In Archimedes' principle, its sole function is to allow buoyancy of anything to be calculated. He told me that all bodies, including our own, have a net force that is either positive or negative when entering a liquid. If a net force is positive, an object will rise. If negative, it will sink. Something that has a zero net force will do neither and remain in place. He told me that as living creatures, we can alter our buoyancy by using our breath and adjusting the position of our limbs, especially our head, in order to affect our center of gravity. The rocks in his backpack were there, so he could see what it would take to adjust his own breathing to remain afloat. I was shocked when he said that, and asked if he thought it would be dangerous to jump into the pool with rocks in his backpack. He shook his head, saying that there was no danger in it, only results. The results being either he himself was displacing water enough to disrupt its flow, or that he would rise and not be a problem for the water. He stated adamantly that he did not want to be a problem for the water. He didn't explicitly say it, but I knew he was referring to the conversation we'd had the day we met, regarding his feelings of being an object of displacement in the friend group. I told him once again that we didn't feel that way. We wanted him to have a day where we did what he wanted, because we wanted him to feel welcome. He didn't move. He didn't look at me. He just simply replied that we were doing this because he was inadvertently causing displacement, If it were up to him, he'd rather have us not so concerned about him. Then he stood up, ran, and jumped in the pool. My head was spinning from what he'd said. Cheers from the others directed at Chris sounded muffled when he confided in me that this all felt like him causing everyone problems. 2 days. I had been involved for 2 days. It was then I realized that Chris sort of scared me. His obsession with the Archimedes principle and the strange ways he experimented with his own self-worth through it were unsettling to me. I was just trying to have fun with new friends, and it was dawning on me that something very askew was happening. Chris floated back to the top and lay on the water with his backpack facing towards the bottom of the pool. I couldn't help but just stare at him. I tried so hard in my head to wrap my mind around what it was he was trying to convey to me at that time. I know now, and in hindsight, in certain circumstances, is unwittingly cruel. That day was over quicker than expected. I imagine I'd wasted a great deal of time just contemplating what Chris had said to me, and thus it flew by without me noticing. That night, my dad didn't work and wanted to hang out with me. It was the same as it always was when we hung out. We picked out a Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee flick and ordered in. We'd talk through the whole movie until the star actor started to whoop ass all over the screen, in which we'd shut up and watch as they alone took on what must have been 50-plus stuntmen. It was around the start of one of those scenes when my dad's phone rang. It was my mom, calling to check in on me. We hadn't spoken in the near week and a half I'd been gone, putting it to about 3 weeks of us not having a real conversation. My mood soured. I wanted to apologize for what I'd said, and planned to when my dad finished talking to her. That opportunity never came. The conversation gradually increased in volume on both ends of the phone until they were screaming at each other about me. Something from my mom about not letting me eat pizza because of my behavior. Something from my dad about taking care of his son. I cranked up the volume on the TV, but could never fully drown out the sounds. It made me think of what Chris had said, and how I, in that moment, felt so much like a displacement in both of their lives. The liquid of their conversation had my mass take up space until it ruined both their evenings. Was this how Chris always felt? Did he feel that way with his dad as well? I didn't sleep much that night. I just laid there and compared my own disruption of my parents' lives to the Archimedes principle. If I had been buoyant enough, controlled my breath right, maybe I wouldn't have told my mom I hated her. I barely felt like leaving the house the next day, but I knew if I laid around playing games all day, it would come back to haunt me. I texted the group to see if they had any plans. Most of them were busy, but they told me Chris would likely be there and I should go see if he was. If I was being totally honest with myself, I really did not want to hear more horribly tragic ideas masked with science. But at the same time, Chris clearly felt alone in the group. I didn't want him to feel alienated, and so I got ready and headed out. When I got to the park, Chris was nowhere I'd thought to look. He wasn't at the playground. He wasn't in the pool when I looked through the window of the rec center. I'd started to assume he just hadn't come out today. It was when I heard a loud voice shout from nearby that I found him. He was rapidly approaching me, and next to him was a haggard-looking man with bloodshot eyes and clothes that were dirtied from some sort of manual labor or just straight-up lack of care. The man pointed at me and Chris kept his head low. All I could see was that Chris was wearing sunglasses. As they reached me, the dirty-looking man began spouting off swears and slurs at me like I'd never heard before. His eyes were made wild by rage, and whatever substances flowed through his veins at that moment, he was more of a feral dog than a human by my own standards. What he was yelling at me, I couldn't fully understand. Hatred flung from his spit as he shouted about corruption and trying to take his child away. It was baffling, and when I look back on it, he must have thought I was someone else. Just recognized me from spending time with Chris at the park and made a villain out of me in his drug-addled mind. I was sad for him. But then, I remembered how he'd treated Chris. I don't know if it was panic or bravery that set me off, but at some point during this nonsensical tirade, I just snapped. I told him to go fuck himself, and if he put his hands on Chris anymore, I'd get the police involved. Apparently, that was a huge mistake. Made clear to me not only by Chris's reaction of looking dead at me, but made much clearer by the fist that collided with the side of my head. I reeled and held my head from the blow that left my ears ringing. He hit Chris like this every day? He was going to fucking kill him. I pulled my hand away to see blood covering the palm of my hand. People in the park began screaming and coming onto the scene. Chris's dad took Chris by the hand and led him back to the car. I heard people calling 911, but my vision was getting blurry by then, and it all went black. When I woke up, I was in the back of an unmoving ambulance. Paramedics and my dad were talking about the incident when I sat up. They both became extremely attentive to me and also equally questioning. I was within seconds of consciousness when I was bombarded with inquiries regarding what had happened, and I could barely put together the situation myself. It felt like a fever dream how quick and abrupt it had all been. I hadn't suffered a great deal of damage, but my head was cut open from the blow. My dad was being very patient with me, but I could see rage underneath it all. He wanted to kill the man who did this to me. In his defense, so did I. It was then I realized how bad this was. I told my dad and the paramedic that my friend was in danger. He lived with this deranged man and could easily become a murder victim. My dad agreed to contact the police and get everything sorted, and told me to rest. I talked to my mom that night as well. I apologized for my terrible words and told her that I missed her, despite the short time I'd been gone. We chatted for about an hour before I got a message on my phone from an unknown number. I don't remember it verbatim, but there were details I won't ever forget. It was an apology. The message I received was haunting and made me go silent in the middle of speaking with my mother. I could barely piece together what it meant aside from themes very recently brought to my attention. In it, the sender told me that a floating body must equal its weight and buoyancy to remain afloat. I knew then that it was Chris. But that wasn't what gave me pause. He told me that a body must be able to displace its own weight within a liquid to maintain its flotation, and that if it displaced an amount that was beneath its own weight, it had to sink. Then he said that there's a reason he is abused. It is because he is worth too little to float. If he had been able to, perhaps his mom would have found cause to stay. If he was able to displace the correct amount as opposed to constantly taking so much, that maybe his father would have no reason to treat him the way that he did. He told me he was sorry about the attack, and that it would be an issue no longer. He said it was time for him to sink. I tried. I promise you, I tried to get to him in time and frantically called the others and the police and had my father drive me to the recreation center. A window had been shattered in the pool room and Chris was already dead when everyone arrived. He was standing at the bottom of the deep end of the larger pool, and he wore a backpack full of stones. His father wasn't there. I didn't go back to the park after that, and it was only a month later that I decided to go home. I couldn't continue to be around the reminders of that horrible tragedy. I stayed in touch with everyone for a little while, and then eventually we all fell out. Brandon moved out of state, and Keegan just seemingly vanished. I don't know if it was Molly who uploaded the picture she'd taken of me and Chris at the pool, but that was what reminded me this had happened in the first place. Maybe it had been his dad. Found it on Chris's laptop and had cleaned up his act. Too late. It makes me shiver at night thinking about how scientific and planned out Chris's suicide had been. And I don't think I'll ever know why he chose me to unload the information upon. But once his presence had caused a big enough displacement, he decided that it was time. Answers are not something we always receive when something like this occurs. Chris was suffering to a degree that was not being addressed. He wanted to be able to float, and he knew that over time, all corpses do. Thanks for listening, and thank you to my author this week, Some Unholy Obscenity. Fantastic story, very sad story. I like to do these more rooted in realism stories every once in a while, and I feel like sometimes things like this that do happen every day are the scariest of them all. And if you like the show, please follow me on Twitter and Instagram at scareyoutosleep. And you can join the Facebook page by the same name as well. If you'd like to join or follow me personally, you can find me at, I cannot talk tonight, you can find me at Shelby B. Novak on Twitter and Instagram. If you'd like to send in your own stories to be considered for the show, please send them to scareyoutosleep@gmail.com. That's the same place you can also contact me for other things like constructive criticism, or just to say hello, or to confess your undying devotion to me. And if you'd like ad-free versions of this show and bonus episodes, please consider joining the Patreon, patreon.com/scareyoutosleep. And for those new to the show, at the end of the show, I do a little bit of a ramble to unwind at the end of the episode and kind of help you drift off to sleep to my voice. And if you don't like that, that is completely understandable. And you can end the episode here, and thank you so much for coming. Good night. Okay, now that they're all gone, let me tell you about my week. I won't tell you about the whole week. I actually think I'm going to be doing a life update in a couple of weeks on Patreon, because I mentioned last week, if you missed it, or I guess it wasn't last week, it was the beginning of this week because my episode was late. I'm going to be moving soon, and I have a lot to do with that. So next week is going to be a mishmash of things, like a feed drop and something else. There will be something else. I'm not exactly sure what yet, depending on what time. Unfortunately, the first falls on a weekend, and it's just kind of a weird timing thing. Anyway, I'm going to be moving. I'm very excited about it, and so I'll be doing a life update in a couple weeks once I'm settled in on Patreon. And for those of you who aren't on Patreon, every once in a while I do a thing called Ramble You to Sleep, aka Bore You to Sleep, where I just talk about different things. The last one I actually read, it was kind of a an amalgamation of a dark Reddit / a ramble you to sleep. But a lot of times I talk about my life and things, and I think I'm going to do another little life update, which I think would be perfect because my last life update was in January, and this will be 6 months after that, and I'm in a much better place now. Literally, physically, I will be, so that'll be great. I can't remember if I mentioned it in Monday's late episode, but for baking, as far as baking goes, I made a lemon supreme pie. If you like lemon, if you like citrus, this pie is incredible. It's like a base of like a cheesecakey type base with a lemon curd, a homemade lemon curd sort of sauce on top. Well, it's not a sauce, it sets in the fridge. It's a refrigerator pie. It's one of those that, you let it set for a few hours and it sets up. Fantastic. Oh, it's so good. It's one of my favorite pies. I've made it several times. I don't think I changed anything about the recipe. The only change I was asked to make, though, is I make a normal crust, usually like a regular a pie crust. And I had someone tell me that I should try a graham cracker crust because I do think a graham cracker crust does a little better for refrigerator pies. And I'm going to try that. But the recipe always calls for a normal crust, so that's what I always do. But I think I'm going to try a graham cracker crust next time. That, or I've been wanting to try, I've been seeing nut crusts, crusts made out of different types of nuts. I'm really just trying to restrain myself from making a joke about nut crust. I can't even find a good joke. They're playing the Troubadour this Saturday. I don't know. Just forget that. Forget I said. No, I didn't say anything about nut crust. Anyway, I'm going to go. It's kind of late. I'm working on another project that's very exciting. Very exciting. So I have that on my brain. Send me good, very exciting vibes because it's going to be something you will really enjoy. I know that. That's all I can say. But yes, so I will be moving in a couple of weeks. By the way, those of you who have asked about my P.O. box, it will remain the same. And starting on June 1st, I encourage you to start sending things again. I've had several people reach out and say they want to send things. And I love receiving things. You don't have to send me gifts. Please do not think you have to send me gifts. But a lot of you send me letters, and I love snail mail. I love a handwritten letter. It's just, there's something magical about it. I love it. So for those of you who have asked, it will be after June 1st, the same P.O. box, which is, I believe, in the show notes. If it's not in the show notes, then it is on my website, scareyoutosleep.com. There is the P.O. box is there. So after June 1st, feel free to start sending things again. I had to, I didn't shut it down, but I hadn't been able to reach it in 7 months. Has it been like 7 months? I don't know. I don't even know anymore. Anyway, but yeah, come see me at Hellmouth Con if you're in the area, if you'd like to get tickets. I think right now they're having still have early bird tickets. It's not that early, but I think they're still doing early bird tickets. So check those out in the link I leave in the show notes. Come say hello. It makes me feel so good to meet you in real life and hug you if you'd like. I don't have to hug you. That's totally fine. But if you consent to a hug, if you would like a hug, I will hug. If not, I will nod solemnly at you and say thank you. And, or we can shake hands or not. We can touch elbows. Again, the nodding at each other is also available. That is completely fine as well, whatever comfort level you are at. But I will be doing a panel there, and I will also be doing other things that I'm not really sure about yet. I think I'm going to be moderating some interviews and things with some of the cast from Buffy the Vampire Slayer and some of the other guests there. So that's very exciting. Goals, love that, especially my whole life starting over, and it's going to be great. I've been so sappy. Let's stop. Okay. We'll talk about all that in Life Update on Patreon for those who would like to hear. So look out for that. And apologies for any interruptions the next couple weeks. I should have Wi-Fi right away. I did schedule it, but just in case, you you know how these things go. Moving is tough. These things, we'll see. So hopefully I'll have everything up and going and able to just jump right into it and jump right into back into this, into new stuff, into fun stuff. A lot of you wanted, I had been meaning for a long time to start doing some more traditional ASMR on YouTube. That is definitely in the cards. That is something I'm 100,000% very excited to start doing. So again, look out for that. I'm finally going to be able to have a space where I can be alone and film and do all that. Well, Clara will be there. She's asleep right now. She's sleeping so funny. I wish you could see her. Her head's like hanging off a chest of drawers. She looks drunk. It's cute. Little drunk kitty cat. Okay, I'm gonna go. And I hope you're having a fantastic weekend. Go get some sleep. Sweet dreams.
Our faith is our shield.
If Altman was divinely inspired, why did he have to die?
Our sword.
Back off! Stay back!
And our guide.
There are those who will infiltrate
I want you to go undercover.
and corrupt us.
When do I start?
It will make us whole.
Clean incision. I'll clean up the bleeding.
This may be the worst idea I've ever had.
Dead Space Deep Cover is available now. New episodes every other week. You can find Dead Space Deep Cover on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at bloody.fm.